Welcome to Tabo Eminent Channel. On May 26, 1924, President Calvin Coolidge signs into law the Immigration Act of 1924, the most stringent U.S. immigration policy up to that time in the nation's history. The new law, also known as the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, reflected the desire of Americans to isolate themselves from the world after fighting World War I in Europe, which exacerbated growing fears of the spread of communist ideas. It also reflected the pervasiveness of racial discrimination in American society at the time. Many Americans saw the enormous influx of largely unskilled, uneducated immigrants during the early 1900s as causing unfair competition for jobs and land. Thanks for watching. Request you to subscribe the channel. Under the new law, immigration remained open to those with a college education and/or special skills, but entry was denied disproportionately to Eastern and Southern Europeans and Japanese. At the same time, the legislation allowed for more immigration from Northern European nations such as Britain, Ireland and Scandinavian countries. A quota was set that limited immigration to 2% of any given nation's residents already in the U.S. as of 1890, a provision designed to maintain America's largely Northern European racial composition. In 1927, the 2% rule was eliminated and a cap of 150,000 total immigrants annually was established. The law particularly angered Japan, which in 1907 had forged with U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt a gentleman's agreement, which included more liberal immigration quotas for Japan. By 1924, strong U.S. agricultural and labor interests, particularly from California, which had already passed its own exclusionary laws against Japanese immigrants, favored the more restrictive legislation signed by Coolidge. The Japanese government viewed the American law as an insult and protested by declaring May 26 a national day of humiliation in Japan. The law fanned anti-American sentiment in Japan, inspiring a Japanese citizen to commit suicide outside the American embassy in Tokyo in protest. Despite becoming known for such isolationist legislation, Coolidge also established the Statue of Liberty as a national monument in 1924. On May 26, 1924, President Calvin Coolidge signed the Immigration Act of 1924, a landmark law that dramatically reshaped American immigration policy and reflected the deep-rooted anxieties of a nation undergoing rapid social and cultural change. Officially called the Johnson-Reed Act, it introduced a strict quota system based on national origins, favoring immigrants from Northern and Western Europe while virtually closing the doors to those from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as most of Asia. The law set annual immigration quotas to 2% of the number of people from each nationality based on the 1890 U.S. Census. This census was deliberately chosen because it predated the massive influx of immigrants from Italy, Poland, Russia, and other Southern and Eastern European countries. By using this earlier census, lawmakers ensured that future immigrants would overwhelmingly resemble the earlier waves of predominantly Anglo-Saxon settlers. The quotas were a clear attempt to preserve what many at the time saw as the ethnic purity of the United States. One of the most controversial aspects of the act was the complete exclusion of immigrants from Asia, including Japan. This provision caused outrage in Japan and significantly strained U.S.-Japanese relations. The law followed in the footsteps of earlier exclusionary measures, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, but it was more comprehensive in its scope. It codified racial and ethnic prejudices into law, institutionalizing discrimination for decades. President Coolidge, in signing the bill, reflected the nativist mood of the country. He famously declared, "America must be kept American," a phrase that underscored the widespread fear that immigration threatened the cultural and racial identity of the nation. Many Americans at the time believed that the influx of new immigrants would undermine social order and American values. These fears were fueled by rising nationalism, eugenics theories, and the Red Scare that followed World War I. The effects of the Immigration Act of 1924 were profound and long-lasting. The 1924 Act also had tragic consequences. During the 1930s and 1940s, thousands of Jews fleeing Nazi persecution were denied entry into the U.S. because of its strict quotas. Today, the Immigration Act of 1924 is remembered as a stark example of how racial and ethnic prejudices shaped U.S. policy. It serves as a reminder of the dangers of legislating based on fear and discrimination, and it remains a significant chapter in the complex history of American immigration. The Immigration Act of 1924 was not just a piece of legislation. It was a defining moment in American history that symbolized the country's shift inward after decades of welcoming immigrants from around the world. After the dramatic waves of immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many Americans, especially those in rural areas, felt that the country was becoming overwhelmed by unfamiliar cultures, languages, and religions. These concerns were heightened by rapid urbanization, labor unrest, and the fear of radical political movements, particularly communism, following the Russian Revolution of 1917. The Red Scare of the early 1920s had left many Americans wary of foreigners, who were often stereotyped as anarchists or revolutionaries. Behind the law were powerful influences, including nativist organizations like the Immigration Restriction League and prominent supporters of eugenics, a now discredited ideology that promoted the idea of racial superiority and the selective breeding of humans. These groups argued that immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, such as Italians, Poles, and Jews, were genetically inferior and posed a threat to the social fabric of the United States. The act was seen by its supporters as a way to protect the American way of life by keeping the nation racially pure. Interestingly, the act also reflected growing U.S. confidence on the world stage. After World War I, the United States emerged as a major global power and no longer felt as reliant on the labor and population growth brought by immigration. The effects of the act were both immediate and far-reaching. Immigration dropped sharply. Countries in Northern and Western Europe, such as Britain, Germany, and Ireland, continued to send relatively large numbers of immigrants, but those from other regions were nearly shut out. Asian countries were hit hardest. The law barred nearly all immigration from Japan and the rest of Asia, despite previous treaties and diplomatic efforts. Japan, in particular, was deeply insulted by the law, and the ban contributed to rising tensions that would eventually help fuel the path to World War II in the Pacific. By closing the door to many seeking refuge, it indirectly sealed the fate of countless individuals during the 1930s and 1940s who were trying to escape fascist regimes in Europe. For example, many Jewish families who tried to flee Nazi Germany found their immigration applications rejected because the U.S. had already reached its tight quotas for those countries. Looking back, the Immigration Act of 1924 is often seen as a stark example of how fear and prejudice can shape national policy.